The gunshot split the amber sky like a knife through silk, and Margaret Vance watched in horror from her porch as the cowboy jerked backward off his horse and hit the dusty ground with a sickening thud. The year was 1872, and violence had become as common as breathing in Downeyville, California. But something about this particular shooting made her feet move before her mind could catch up. The rider who fired the shot wheeled his mount around and galloped away toward the Sierra Nevada foothills, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the crumpled form of a man bleeding into the earth as the sun melted like honey along the horizon. Margaret dropped the bucket of water she had been carrying and hiked up her skirts, running across the yard with her heart hammering against her ribs. The wounded man lay face down, his hat rolled several feet away, and she could see the dark stains spreading across the back of his shoulder. His horse had stopped about 20 yards up the road, reins dragging in the dirt, too well trained to bolt completely even after the chaos. She fell to her knees beside him and pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thank God, weak but steady. "Can you hear me?" she demanded, already trying to figure out how she would move him. He was a big man, easily 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and the kind of solid build that came from years of hard work. His dark hair was matted with dust and sweat, and when she managed to roll him partially onto his side, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind but still young, probably not more than 27 or 28 years old. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, revealing a startling shade of green before they closed again. Margaret looked around desperately. The main street of Downeyville was nearly empty in the dying light, most folks already home for supper. Her closest neighbor was old Mrs. Chen 3 houses down, and there was no way the elderly woman could help lift a man this size. The doctor's office was on the other side of town, and she knew with gut-wrenching certainty that this man did not have time for her to run there and back. "All right," she said, more to herself than to him. "All right, we are doing this." She got behind him and hooked her arms under his shoulders, careful to avoid the wound, and began dragging him backward toward her house. He was even heavier than she expected, dead weight that made her muscles scream in protest after just a few feet. Sweat broke out across her forehead and soaked through her dress, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. The 20 yards to her porch might as well have been 20 miles. Twice she had to stop and rest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and each time she checked to make sure he was still breathing. The blood trail they left behind looked black in the fading light. When she finally got him to the porch steps, she wanted to weep with frustration. There was no way she could drag him up 3 steps and through her door. She sat down hard on the bottom step, trying to think. Then she remembered the old canvas tarp her father had used for hauling firewood before he died 2 years ago. She left the cowboy propped against the steps and ran to the shed, found the tarp covered in dust and mouse droppings, and dragged it back. She spread it out beside him, rolled him onto it with great effort, and used the tarp to slide him up the steps one at a time, her back and arms burning with the effort. Inside, she did not even try to get him to the bedroom. She cleared her kitchen table with one sweep of her arm, sending dishes crashing to the floor, and used every ounce of strength she had left to haul him onto the solid oak surface. He groaned, the first real sound he had made, and she took that as a good sign. At least he was still in there, still fighting. Margaret lit every lamp in the kitchen and hauled the big pot of water she kept on the stove over to the table. She had been heating it for laundry, but that did not matter now. She grabbed the sharpest knife she owned, the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, and the clean sheets from the linen closet. Her hand shook as she cut away his shirt, peeling the blood-soaked fabric away from the wound. The bullet had entered high on his left shoulder blade, and when she carefully probed around the injury, she could feel the hard lump of lead lodged against bone. "Please do not die on my kitchen table," she whispered, pouring whiskey over the knife blade and her own hands. "Please." She had seen her father treat wounded men before, back when their house had been a way station for travelers. He had shown her how to clean wounds, how to dig out bullets, how to stitch flesh back together. She had been 14 then, assisting with shaking hands while he talked her through each step. Now she was 24, and he was 6 feet under in the Downeyville cemetery, and this man's life was in her hands alone. Margaret took a deep breath and began to work. She cut into the swollen flesh around the wound, and fresh blood welled up, warm and slick. The cowboy jerked and cried out, his body trying to twist away, but he did not fully wake. She worked as quickly as she dared, her fingers slippery with blood, probing for the bullet. The minutes stretched like hours. Twice she thought she had it, only to have it slip away from her forceps. Her back ached from bending over the table, and tears of frustration blurred her vision, but she blinked them away and kept going. Finally, blessedly, she felt the forceps close around the bullet and pulled it free. It clinked into the dish she had set aside, a misshapen piece of lead that had nearly ended a man's life. She poured more whiskey into the wound, earning another groan from her patient, and began the painstaking process of stitching him closed. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, steady and calm, telling her to make the stitches small and even, not to pull the thread too tight. When she finally tied off the last stitch, her hands were cramping, and her whole body felt like it might collapse. But she was not done yet. She cleaned the wound again, packed it with clean cloth, and bound it tightly with strips torn from her sheets. Then she checked his pulse again and found it stronger than before. His breathing had evened out, and some of the terrible grayness had left his face. Margaret slumped into a chair and let herself shake for a few minutes, the terror and exhaustion catching up with her all at once. The kitchen looked like an abattoir, blood on the table, on the floor, soaked into her dress and caked under her fingernails. The pile of ruined dishes lay scattered where they had fallen. She should clean it up, she should move him somewhere more comfortable, she should do 100 things, but for just a moment, she let herself sit in the lamplight and be grateful that he was still breathing. When she finally got her legs steady enough to stand, she fetched blankets and pillows and did her best to make him comfortable on the table. She could not move him again tonight, not by herself, and the table was probably better than trying to wrestle him into a bed anyway. She pulled a chair close and settled in to watch him through the night. Every few minutes she checked his pulse and his breathing and put her hand on his forehead to check for fever. He was warm, but not dangerously so. Not yet. The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. Once he stirred and muttered something she could not quite make out, and she gave him sips of water that he swallowed reflexively. Twice she had to change the dressing when blood seeped through, her heart clenching with fear that she had missed something, that he was bleeding internally, that all her work had been for nothing. But each time the bleeding slowed and stopped again, and she allowed herself to hope. Dawn was painting the sky gray when his eyes finally opened and stayed open. He stared up at the ceiling for a long moment, confusion written across his features, then slowly turned his head to look at her. Margaret sat up straighter in her chair, suddenly very aware of how she must look, with blood dried on her dress and her hair falling out of its pins. "You are alive," she said, and was horrified when her voice cracked on the words. "Appears so," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "though I feel like I have been trampled by a whole herd of cattle." He tried to move and immediately gasped in pain, his face going white. "What happened?" "You were shot," Margaret said, reaching out to put a hand on his good shoulder, keeping him still. "Do you remember? Someone shot you off your horse just at sunset yesterday. I dragged you inside and got the bullet out." He stared at her like she had sprouted a second head. "You dug a bullet out of me?" "Someone had to," she said defensively. "The doctor was too far away, and you were bleeding badly. My father used to help injured travelers. I have done it before." "You saved my life," he said slowly, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of wonder mixed with dawning realization. "I would have bled out in the street if you had not pulled me in here." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away. "Well, I could not just leave you there. Could I? What kind of person would that make me?" "A practical one," he said. "Most folks in these parts would not want to get involved. Helping a stranger who has been shot is a good way to inherit his enemies." He managed a weak smile. "I am Marcus Montgomery, by the way. Figure you ought to know the name of the man bleeding all over your kitchen table." "Margaret Vance," she replied, "and you are welcome to bleed on my table if it means you are still alive to tell me your name." She stood and fetched a cup of water, helping him drink. "Do you know who shot you?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Ben Calloway, mean son of a, well, mean man. He has been trying to run me off my land for 6 months now. I have got a claim up in the hills, good water and grazing. He wants it." He closed his eyes. "I should have been more careful. Should have known he would try something." "You need to rest," Margaret said firmly. "We can worry about Ben Calloway later. Right now, you need to focus on healing." "I cannot stay here," Marcus protested. "It is not proper. You are an unmarried woman, are you not? Having a strange man in your house will cause talk." "Let them talk," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "I am not about to throw you out when you can barely lift your head. Besides, it is not like you are in any condition to threaten my virtue." She softened her tone. "Please, I did not work all night to save your life, just to have you undo it by being stubborn." He looked at her for a long moment, and she found herself unable to look away from those startling green eyes. There was pain in them, yes, but also intelligence and a kind of rough kindness that she had not expected. Finally he nodded, just a small movement of his head. "All right, but only until I can ride. I will not bring trouble to your door any longer than necessary." "Good," Margaret said, and found herself smiling despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "Now, close your eyes and rest. I am going to make some broth, and when you wake up, you're going to eat every drop of it." Over the next 3 days, Margaret barely left Marcus's side. She moved him to her father's old bed on the second evening, with help from Tom Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandson, who had come by with a basket of food from his grandmother and proved strong enough to help carry the patient upstairs. The young man had given her a knowing look, but had the grace not to ask too many questions. By then, word had spread through Downeyville that Margaret Vance was harboring a wounded cowboy in her home, and she could feel the weight of judgment every time she went to the general store or the market. She did not care. Let them whisper. She had more important things to worry about, like the fever that spiked on the second night, making Marcus delirious and thrashing in the bed. She spent hours sponging him down with cool water, holding him still when he tried to get up, murmuring reassurances when he called out for people she did not know. When the fever finally broke near dawn, leaving him weak and soaked with sweat, she changed the sheets with him still in them and collapsed in the chair beside the bed for a few hours of sleep. On the morning of the 4th day, she woke to find him watching her. She had fallen asleep in the chair again, her neck at an awkward angle that was going to make her regret it later. The early light was streaming through the window, painting everything gold, and Marcus was propped up against the pillows, looking more alive than he had any right to after everything he had been through. "You should sleep in a proper bed," he said when she sat up, wincing as her spine cracked. "Not in that chair." "This is a proper bed," Margaret said, gesturing to where he lay. "And you are in it. I have been sleeping in my room." That was not entirely true. She had been splitting her time between her own bed and the chair, never wanting to be too far away in case he needed her. "You are a terrible liar," Marcus said, but he was smiling. "Thank you for everything. I know I said it before, but I do not think you understand what you have done. You did not just save my life. You gave me a reason to believe there is still good in the world." Margaret felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in the 2 years since her father died and left her alone in this house. She busied herself straightening the already straight blankets, not trusting herself to meet his eyes. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Marcus said quietly. "They would not have, and we both know it." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with something Margaret could not quite name. She finally looked up and found him still watching her, his expression open and honest in a way that made her breath catch. He was handsome, she realized, even with several days of beard growth, and the pallor of injury still clinging to him. It was not just his features, though those were fine enough, but something in the way he looked at her, like she was someone worth looking at. "I should change your dressing," she said, needing something to do with her hands. "And you need to eat. I made more broth, and I think you are strong enough for some bread, too." "I would sell my soul for a beefsteak," Marcus said wistfully, but he did not protest when she brought him broth and soft bread instead. He ate slowly, and she could see how much effort it took, but he finished everything she gave him. When he was done, she carefully peeled away the bandage and examined the wound. It looked good, no red streaks or signs of infection, the stitches holding clean and tight. "You did a fine job," Marcus said, trying to crane his neck to see. "Better than some doctors I have had work on me." "You have been shot before?" Margaret asked, surprised. "Twice," he admitted. "Once during the war when I was barely old enough to hold a rifle, and once 3 years ago in a dispute over a card game. That one was my own fault for being young and stupid. This time, I was just in Ben Calloway's way." Margaret finished applying fresh bandaging and helped him ease back against the pillows. "Tell me about your land," she said, settling back into the chair. "The place he wants so badly he was willing to kill you for it." Marcus's face softened. It is the most beautiful place you ever saw. There is a creek that runs through the property year-round, cold and clear, full of trout. The grass grows tall in the meadows, perfect for cattle or horses. I have got a small cabin I built myself. Nothing fancy, but it is mine. I have been working that claim for 2 years, proving it up, planning to file for full ownership this fall. He paused. Calloway has a big spread nearby, but his water is not reliable. He has had his eye on my creek since the day I staked my claim. So he decided to shoot you and take it, Margaret said, anger heating her voice. Can you not go to the sheriff? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sheriff Dawson is Calloway's cousin. Even if he was not, it would be my word against Calloway's, and Calloway has money and influence. I am just a cowboy trying to make something of myself. That is not right, Margaret said fiercely. You worked for that land. You built something from nothing. He has no right to take it from you. Right does not mean much out here, Marcus said, but he was looking at her with something like admiration. You have got fire in you, Margaret Vance. I bet you do not back down from much. I do not back down from anything, she said, lifting her chin. My father taught me to stand my ground, no matter what. Her expression clouded. He died 2 years ago. Influenza. I have been running this place by myself ever since. That cannot be easy, Marcus said gently. This town cannot be kind to a woman alone. It is not, Margaret admitted. But I manage. I take in sewing and mending. I have got a good vegetable garden, and I rent out the rooms to travelers sometimes. I get by. She did not mention the nights she lay awake worrying about money, or the way some men in town looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving, preferably by marriage to one of them. You are remarkable, Marcus said, and the simple honesty in his voice made her blush again. Over the following week, Marcus grew stronger each day. He graduated from broth to solid food, and by the 7th day he was able to sit up on his own and even stand for short periods, though his left arm was still mostly useless and would be for some time. Margaret helped him walk around the room, her arm around his waist, steadying him when his legs wavered. She tried not to think about how solid he felt against her side, or how her heart beat faster when he smiled at her in thanks. They talked for hours during those long days of recovery. Marcus told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his family to cholera when he was 16, about drifting west in search of something he could not quite name until he found that piece of land in the California hills. Margaret told him about her childhood in Downeyville, about her mother who died giving birth to a stillborn baby when Margaret was 10, about learning to be strong because her father needed her to be. They discovered they both loved reading, a rare luxury in their hard lives. Margaret lent him her precious copy of Great Expectations, and they spent an entire afternoon debating the ending. They both had a weakness for apple pie. They both believed that horses were better judges of character than most people. They both knew what it meant to be lonely, even when surrounded by others. On the 10th day, Margaret came upstairs to find Marcus standing at the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. He had managed to dress himself in the clean clothes she had mended for him, though his shirt hung loose on the left side to accommodate the bandaging. I should be getting back, he said without turning around. My stock will be scattered to hell and back by now, and God knows what Calloway has been up to while I have been laid up here. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had known this moment was coming, but she was not ready for it. You are not healed enough to ride hard. The wound could reopen. I will take it slow, Marcus said, finally turning to face her. His expression was troubled. Margaret, I cannot thank you enough for what you have done. You saved my life, you nursed me back to health, and you asked for nothing in return. If there is ever anything I can do to repay you— You do not owe me anything, Margaret said quickly, hating how her voice sounded small and lost. I am just glad you are going to be all right. Marcus crossed the room, moving carefully, but with more steadiness than he had shown before. He stood in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. That is not true, and we both know it. I owe you everything. He hesitated, and she saw him struggling with something. I wish I could stay longer. I wish I did not have to go back to that claim and all the trouble waiting for me there. These past 10 days have been the happiest I have been in longer than I can remember, even with the gunshot wound. Margaret's heart was beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. Then stay, she whispered. Just one more day. If I stay one more day, I will want to stay another, And another after that, Marcus said, his voice rough. And you deserve better than a broke cowboy who cannot even protect his own land, much less take care of you the way you deserve. Maybe I should decide what I deserve, Margaret said, finding courage she did not know she possessed. Maybe I am tired of people telling me what is good for me or what is proper. Maybe I want to make my own choices. Marcus's eyes searched her face, and what he saw there made his expression shift into something tender and wondering. Margaret, he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. I am falling for you. I have been fighting it, telling myself it was just gratitude or the closeness that comes from you taking care of me. But it is more than that. You are brilliant and brave and kind, and being around you makes me want to be a better man. You are already a good man, Margaret said, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. You are honest and hard-working and gentle. When you talk about your land, your eyes light up like you are describing something sacred. And when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I have not felt since my father died. I should not kiss you, Marcus said, even as he leaned closer. It would not be right, not when I do not have anything to offer you. Then do not kiss me, Margaret said, closing the distance between them until their lips were almost touching. Let me kiss you. She pressed her mouth to his, gentle at first, afraid of hurting him. But Marcus made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back with a hunger that took her breath away. His good arm came around her waist, pulling her close, and she lost herself in the feel of him, the taste of him, the rightness of it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Margaret felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Marry me, Marcus said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I know it is crazy. I know we have only known each other 10 days. I know I should court you properly and ask permission and do everything the right way. But Margaret, I cannot imagine riding away from here and leaving you behind. Marry me and come with me to the claim. We will build a life together. We will make that cabin into a home. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. Yes, she said, laughing at the shock on his face. Yes, I will marry you. I do not care if it is crazy or improper or too fast. These 10 days have shown me more about who you are than 10 years of formal courtship would have. I know your heart, Marcus Montgomery, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Margaret felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. We should do it soon, Marcus said, before Calloway decides to finish what he started. I want you protected by my name, at least. If something happens to me, the land will go to you as my widow. Nothing is going to happen to you, Margaret said fiercely. We are going to face Calloway together, and we are going to win. But yes, soon, tomorrow if we can. They went to see Reverend Thomas that afternoon, Marcus moving slowly but with determination. The Reverend was surprised, but agreed to perform the ceremony the following day. He gave them a lecture about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of building a life on faith and trust, and they nodded dutifully through all of it, sneaking glances at each other like conspiratorial children. That evening, Margaret made a proper dinner to celebrate. She roasted a chicken and made biscuits and used the last of her preserves for a pie. They ate at the kitchen table where she had first laid him 10 days ago, and the irony was not lost on either of them. I should write to my aunt, Margaret said as they cleared the dishes. She is my only living relative in San Francisco. She has been after me for years to come live with her. Will she be disappointed that you are marrying a cowboy instead? Marcus asked. Probably, Margaret admitted. But she will get over it, especially when we give her grandnieces and grandnephews to spoil. She blushed at her own boldness, but Marcus just pulled her close with his good arm and kissed her forehead. How many children do you want? He asked. As many as God sees fit to give us, Margaret said. I always wanted a big family. It was so lonely being an only child, especially after Mama died. Then we will have a house full, Marcus promised. We will have to add on to the cabin. I have been planning it anyway, but now I will need to make it bigger. His expression grew serious. Margaret, I need you to understand what you are agreeing to. Life on the claim will not be easy. It is isolated, the work is hard, and we will be starting with almost nothing. And there is the matter of Calloway. He will not give up just because I survived the first time. I am not afraid of hard work, Margaret said. And as for Calloway, well, he has not met both of us yet, has he? She squared her shoulders. We are stronger together than either of us is alone. We will figure it out. They were married the next day in the small church at the edge of town. Mrs. Chen and her grandson Tom stood as witnesses, along with the Reverend's wife. Margaret wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and she wove wildflowers into her hair since she had no veil. Marcus stood beside her in his mended clothes, his left arm still bound close to his chest, and when he said his vows, his voice was strong and sure. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed her tenderly, and Margaret felt her heart swell with happiness so intense it was almost painful. This was right. This was meant to be. She had saved his life, and in doing so, he had saved hers from loneliness and purposelessness. They were two halves of the same whole, and nothing, not Ben Calloway or hardship or the judgment of others, could tear them apart. They spent their wedding night in Margaret's house, and in the morning they began preparing for the journey to Marcus's claim. Margaret sold most of her furniture and household goods, keeping only what they could carry, or what had sentimental value. Her father's books, her mother's quilt, the good cooking pots and dishes, everything else went to pay for supplies they would need. Marcus retrieved his horse, which had been stabled at the livery all this time, and bought a second mount for Margaret, a gentle mare named Daisy. On a bright morning, 2 weeks after the shooting, they left Downieville heading into the hills. Marcus led the way, moving carefully to avoid jostling his still healing shoulder. Margaret rode beside him, her heart full of hope and anticipation. The trail wound up through pine forests and across mountain meadows carpeted with wildflowers. Hawks circled overhead in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They traveled for most of the day, stopping frequently to rest Marcus. Margaret could see the journey was taking its toll on him, but he never complained. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they crested a ridge, and Marcus pulled his horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing down into a valley below. "That is home." Margaret looked and felt her breath catch. The valley was everything Marcus had described and more. A creek sparkled silver in the sunlight, winding through green meadows. A small log cabin stood in a grove of pines, smoke curling from its chimney. There were fences marking off pastures, a small barn, a corral with several horses visible in it. "Someone is here," Margaret said, suddenly nervous. "Look, there is smoke." Marcus tensed. "That should not be. I have not had anyone watching the place." His jaw set in a hard line. "Stay behind me." They rode down into the valley cautiously. As they approached the cabin, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad, maybe 40 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and a rifle cradled in his arms. But his face broke into a wide grin when he saw Marcus. "About time you showed up," the man called. "I was starting to think you had died, and no one bothered to tell me." "James?" Marcus sounded stunned. "What are you doing here?" "Heard you took a bullet," the man said, lowering his rifle. "Figured your stock would need tending, and your property would need defending while you were laid up. So I came." His eyes moved to Margaret, and his expression grew curious. "And you brought company." Marcus dismounted carefully and helped Margaret down. "James, this is my wife, Margaret. Margaret, this is James Fletcher. We rode together during the war, and we have been friends ever since. He has a claim about 20 miles north of here." "Your wife?" James's eyebrows shot up. "Well, hell, Marcus. You work fast." But he was smiling as he offered Margaret his hand. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery. Any woman who convinced this stubborn cuss to marry her must be something special." "She is," Marcus said, putting his good arm around Margaret's waist. "She is the one who saved my life, dragged me inside and dug the bullet out herself." James let out a low whistle. "Is that so? Well then, madam, I owe you a debt of thanks. This ugly son of a gun is like a brother to me." He gestured toward the cabin. "Come on in. I have got stew on the stove and coffee hot. You both look like you could use a meal and a rest." Inside, the cabin was small but well made. One main room with a fireplace, a sleeping loft above, and a lean-to addition, in back for storage. It was clean and tidy, and Margaret could see Marcus's hand in every carefully fitted log and smoothly planed board. James had been living there in Marcus's absence, and he had kept the place in good order. Over dinner, James filled them in on what had happened while Marcus was recovering. Calloway had sent men to sniff around the property twice, but James had run them off with his rifle and a few well-chosen words. Some of Marcus's cattle had wandered, but James had rounded up most of them. Everything was more or less as Marcus had left it. "Calloway is not going to be happy when he hears you are back," James said seriously. "He has been telling folks in town that you probably died of your wounds, and he has been sniffing around about how to file a claim on abandoned property." "This property is not abandoned," Marcus said grimly. "And now it belongs to my wife as much as it belongs to me. If something happens to me, it goes to her." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Margaret said firmly, echoing her words from before. "We are going to settle this with Calloway, one way or another." James looked between them and shook his head. "Like I said, Marcus, you married someone special." He stood. "I will head back to my own place tomorrow. You two need time to settle in, but I'm only a day's ride away if you need me. And Marcus, watch your back. Calloway is the kind of snake who strikes from the shadows." "I know," Marcus said, "and thank you, James, for everything." After James left the next morning, Margaret and Marcus spent the day making the cabin truly theirs. Margaret unpacked her things, hanging her mother's quilt on the wall and arranging her father's books on the shelf Marcus had built. Marcus showed her around the property, introducing her to the horses and the handful of cattle he had managed to acquire. He showed her the garden plot, overgrown with weeds now, and the place by the creek where he liked to fish. "We will need to build another room," Marcus said, standing with his good arm around her as they looked at the cabin. "A proper bedroom at least, maybe two for when the children come." "That sounds perfect," Margaret said, leaning into him. "Marcus, I love it here. I love the mountains and the creek and the way the wind sounds in the pines. I love that you built this with your own hands. It feels like home already." He kissed the top of her head. "That is because you are here. This place was just a house before. Now it is a home." They fell into a rhythm over the next weeks. Marcus's shoulder continued to heal, and he gradually regained use of his arm. Margaret kept the house, tended the garden, and learned to manage the stock. She had grown up in town, but she was a quick learner and not afraid of hard work. Marcus taught her to milk the cow he had traded for, to gather eggs from the chickens that scratched around the yard, to read the weather signs in the clouds and the way the horses acted. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains, and Marcus would pull Margaret close and tell her about his plans for the property. He wanted to build up the herd, eventually sell beef to the mining camps. He wanted to plant an orchard, apples and pears, that would thrive in the mountain soil. He wanted to build a real house with glass windows and a wood floor, and enough rooms for the big family they planned. Margaret listened and added her own ideas, and they dreamed together under the stars. She had never been happier. The work was hard, yes, and the isolation could be challenging, but being with Marcus made everything worthwhile. He was a gentle husband, patient with her inexperience, making her feel cherished and desired. He made her laugh with his dry humor, and he listened when she talked. Really listened like her words mattered. The only shadow on their happiness was the knowledge that Calloway was still out there, still wanting what they had. They saw his men riding the borders of the property twice, never crossing onto Marcus's land, but making their presence known. Marcus took to wearing his gun belt again, and he taught Margaret to shoot, spending hours with her at makeshift targets until she could hit what she aimed at more often than not. "I will not always be here to protect you," Marcus said, watching her reload the revolver. "You need to be able to protect yourself." "We are going to be fine," Margaret insisted, but she practiced faithfully. The truth was she was nervous. She had heard stories about Ben Calloway, about men who had crossed him and later been found dead in convenient accidents. But she refused to live in fear. This was their land, their home, and they had every right to be here. The confrontation came on a hot afternoon in late summer. Margaret was in the garden, pulling weeds and checking on the vegetables that were finally starting to produce, when she heard horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop when she saw 5 riders coming down the trail. The man in front was big and hard-faced, maybe 50 years old, sitting his horse like he owned the world. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the cabin, keeping her movements casual even though her heart was racing. Marcus was in the barn, and she needed to get to him without alarming the riders. But before she could reach the barn door, Marcus emerged, and she could tell by the set of his shoulders that he had seen the riders too. He crossed to her quickly and positioned himself slightly in front of her, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, and the big man in front looked around with an expression of disdain. "So," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "the rumors are true. You survived." "Hello, Calloway," Marcus said, his voice level. "This is private property. State your business or move on." "No need to be hostile, Montgomery," Calloway said, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "I came to make you an offer, a generous one, considering." He gestured around at the property. "This is nice land, but it is dangerous out here. Accidents happen. Bears, mountain lions, falling rocks. A man could get hurt, or worse. And that would be a shame, especially now that I see you have got yourself a wife." His eyes moved to Margaret, and she felt her skin crawl at the way he looked at her, like she was a possession to be assessed and valued. "The land is not for sale," Marcus said flatly. "Not now, not ever. This is my claim, legal and registered, and you have got no right to it." "Everything has a price," Calloway said. "I am offering you $500 for the property, the stock, and all improvements. That is more than fair." "You shot me in the back and left me to die in the street," Marcus said, his voice hard as stone. "You have been trying to steal my land for 2 years, and now you ride up here and offer me a fraction of what it is worth and expect me to take it? No. Get off my property." Calloway's expression darkened. "You are making a mistake, Montgomery. I am trying to be reasonable here. I do not want more blood on my hands. Take the money and find somewhere else to settle. There is plenty of land in California." "None of it yours to give," Margaret said, finding her voice. She stepped up beside Marcus, refusing to hide behind him. "My husband told you no. This is our home, and we are not leaving, so you can take your money and your threats and get out." One of the other riders, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, laughed. "She has got spirit, boss. Shame to waste that." "Shut up, Chet," Calloway snapped. He looked at Marcus and Margaret for a long moment, his expression calculating. "You have got 1 week," he finally said. 1 week to reconsider. After that, well, accidents happen, and I will not be held responsible." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed. They rode back up the trail, but Margaret could feel them watching over their shoulders, and she knew this was far from over. Marcus was shaking with suppressed rage. "He threatened you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That son of a bitch threatened you right to my face." "Marcus," Margaret said, putting her hand on his arm, "we are not going to let him win. We are going to find a way through this." "How?" Marcus demanded. "He has the money and the power. He has the sheriff in his pocket. Even if I killed him in self-defense, I would hang for it." He turned to her, anguish written across his face. "Margaret, maybe you should go back to Downeyville. Stay with Mrs. Chen until this is settled. I cannot stand the thought of you getting hurt because of me." "No," Margaret said fiercely. "Absolutely not. We are married, Marcus. That means we face things together, good or bad. I am not running away, and I am not leaving you alone to deal with this." She cupped his face in her hands. "We are going to be smart about this. We are going to find a way that does not involve you getting killed or arrested, but we are doing it together." Marcus closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against hers. "I do not deserve you," he whispered. "Yes, you do," Margaret said, "and I deserve you. We deserve this life we are building. Now come inside, and we are going to think this through." They spent the evening talking through options. They could not go to the sheriff, who was Calloway's creature. They could try to get support from other small holders in the area, but most folks were too afraid of Calloway to stand up to him. They could go to the land office in Sacramento and make sure all Marcus's paperwork was in perfect order, but that would not stop Calloway from arranging an accident. "What about the newspapers?" Margaret said suddenly. "There is a reporter in Sacramento who has been writing about land fraud and corruption. I read some of his articles when I used to get the paper. If we could get our story to him, if we could get this out in public where people could see what Calloway is doing, maybe that would protect us." Marcus looked thoughtful. "It might work. If enough people know about the situation, Calloway could not make a move without everyone knowing he was behind it. He has a reputation to protect, even if he is corrupt. Bad publicity could hurt his business dealings." He nodded slowly. "It is worth a try. One of us would have to go to Sacramento. It is 3 days' ride from here." "I will go," Margaret said. "You need to stay here and protect the property, and with your shoulder still healing, a long ride like that could set you back." "Absolutely not," Marcus said. "I am not sending you off alone on a 6-day journey through wild country. If anyone goes, it is me." They argued about it for an hour, neither willing to give ground. Finally, they agreed that Marcus would ride to James Fletcher's place and asked James to come stay with Margaret while Marcus made the trip to Sacramento. It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than leaving Margaret alone or risking her on the road. Marcus left at first light the next morning, and he was back by evening with James in tow. James had agreed immediately to stay with Margaret, and he brought supplies and his own rifle. With James there to watch over things, Marcus felt comfortable enough to leave on the journey to Sacramento. "You watch her like she is made of glass," Marcus told James as he prepared to leave the next morning. "If Calloway shows up, you get her out of here. To hell with the property. Nothing is worth her life." "I will guard her with my life," James promised solemnly. "You have my word, brother." Marcus held Margaret close for a long time before he mounted his horse. "I will be back in a week," he said. "Maybe less if I push hard, and when I get back, we are going to end this, one way or another." "Be careful," Margaret whispered. "Come back to me." "Always," Marcus promised, and then he was riding away, and Margaret stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge. The next days were the longest of Margaret's life. She tried to keep busy, working in the garden, mending clothes, cooking meals for herself and James. James was a quiet man, respectful of her space, and he spent most of his time patrolling the property or working on repairs that Marcus had not gotten to yet. The nights were the hardest. Margaret lay alone in the bed she shared with Marcus, listening to every sound, jumping at every crack of a branch or cry of an animal. On the fourth day, Calloway's men came back. There were 3 of them this time, including the scarred man named Chet. They did not come to the cabin, but instead spent the day riding the boundaries of the property, occasionally stopping to cut a fence or spook the cattle. James went out to confront them once, and Margaret watched from the porch with her heart in her throat, her hand on the revolver Marcus had left for her. But the men just laughed and rode away when James approached, leaving destruction in their wake that took hours to repair. On the 5th day, Margaret was baking bread when she heard shots fired. She dropped everything and ran outside, gun in hand, to find James running toward the cabin from the direction of the barn. "They set fire to the hay," he shouted. "In the barn, we need water now." They fought the fire for 2 hours, hauling bucket after bucket from the creek, and by the time they got it under control, the barn was half destroyed, and most of Marcus's winter hay supply was gone. Margaret stood looking at the damage, blackened wood and ash everywhere, and felt rage burn through her like the fire itself. "This is my fault," James said, his face grim. "I should have been watching closer. They must have snuck in while I was checking the south fence." "It is not your fault," Margaret said. "It is Calloway's fault, and he is going to pay for this." She turned and walked back to the cabin, her mind working furiously. Calloway was escalating. He was not going to wait for them to leave peacefully. He was going to destroy everything Marcus had built, and if they got in the way, he would destroy them too. She would not let that happen. That night, after James had gone to sleep in the loft, Margaret sat at the table and wrote a letter by lamplight. She wrote down everything that had happened, from the shooting in Downeyville to the threats and the fire. She wrote about Calloway's corruption, about the sheriff who turned a blind eye, about the other small holders he had driven off their land. She wrote it all down in clear, precise detail, and then she sealed it in an envelope and addressed it to the newspaper in Sacramento, to the reporter whose articles she had read. In the morning, she gave the letter to James. "If something happens to me and Marcus," she said, "I need you to make sure this gets to Sacramento. Promise me." James looked at the letter and then at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said firmly. "Marcus will be back today or tomorrow, and we are going to figure this out." Marcus rode in that afternoon, his horse lathered and exhausted from hard travel. Margaret ran to meet him, and he swept her into his arms despite the protest from his still-healing shoulder. "I got the story to the reporter," he said. "He is going to print it. He says there have been complaints about Calloway before, and this might be the evidence he needs to start a real investigation." He pulled back and looked at the burned barn, his expression hardening. "What happened?" They told him about the fire and the harassment, and Marcus's jaw set in a grim line. "That is it," he said. "I am riding into town tomorrow and settling this with Calloway face to face." "No," Margaret said. "That is exactly what he wants. He wants you to come after him so he can kill you and claim self-defense." "Then what do you suggest?" Marcus demanded. We cannot just sit here and wait for him to destroy everything we have. We wait for the article, Margaret said. Once it is published, once people know what is happening, Calloway will not be able to touch us without looking guilty. It is only a few more days. Marcus did not like it, but he agreed. James stayed another day to help repair some of the damage, and then he rode back to his own place, promising to come back if they needed him. Marcus and Margaret settled in to wait, both of them on edge, jumping at every sound. The article appeared in the Sacramento newspaper 4 days later, brought to Downeyville by the weekly mail coach. Margaret and Marcus rode into town to get their mail and found the whole place buzzing with the news. The reporter had done his job well, laying out a pattern of intimidation and violence stretching back years. He had interviewed other ranchers who had been driven off their land, and he had raised questions about the sheriff's relationship with Calloway. It was damning, and it was public. They also found a telegram waiting for them, sent by a lawyer in Sacramento. He had read the article and wanted to take their case. He said he could tie Calloway up in legal proceedings for years if necessary, and he worked on contingency, meaning they would not have to pay unless they won. Marcus and Margaret read the telegram together, and Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest for the first time in weeks. This could work, she said. Between the publicity and the legal pressure, Calloway might back off. But Calloway was not the type to back off. 2 days later, he came to the property himself, alone this time, unarmed and carrying a white handkerchief tied to a stick. Marcus met him in the yard, gun belt on but hands loose at his sides. Margaret stood on the porch, her own gun hidden in the folds of her skirt. "You have made things difficult for me, Montgomery," Calloway said without preamble. "That article has cost me business. I have got investors asking questions I do not want to answer." "Good," Marcus said coldly. "Maybe next time you will think twice before trying to steal a man's land." "I am not here to fight," Calloway said, and he actually sounded tired. "I am here to offer you a deal, a real one this time. I will pay you $2,000 for your claim. That is more than fair market value. You can take that money and start over somewhere else, build something even better. And I will leave you alone. No more trouble, no more threats. You have my word." "Your word is worth nothing," Marcus said. "You shot me in the back." "That was business," Calloway said with a shrug. "Nothing personal, but things have changed now. You have got lawyers and reporters paying attention. I cannot afford to escalate this further, so I am offering you a way out that lets us both walk away." He paused. "This is my final offer, Montgomery. Take it or leave it, but decide now." Marcus looked at Margaret, and she saw the question in his eyes. $2,000 was a fortune. They could buy land somewhere else, build a new life without the constant threat of violence. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But it would also mean Calloway won. It would mean giving up everything Marcus had worked for, everything they had fought for together. Margaret shook her head, just a tiny movement, but Marcus saw it and understood. He turned back to Calloway. "No deal," he said. "This is our land, legally claimed and registered. If you want it, you are going to have to take it from us in court, and I have got a feeling you are going to lose. The whole state is watching now. You cannot bully your way out of this one." Calloway's face darkened with rage. "You are a fool, Montgomery. You and your wife both. You could have walked away rich. Instead, you are going to lose everything, and I am going to enjoy watching it happen." "Get off my property," Marcus said, his hand dropping to his gun. "And do not come back." Calloway stared at him for a long moment, and Margaret held her breath, certain this was about to turn violent. But finally Calloway spat in the dust and turned his horse around. "You have not heard the last of this," he said over his shoulder, and then he was riding away. Marcus sagged with relief, and Margaret ran to him, throwing her arms around him. "That was terrifying," she said. "I thought he was going to shoot you right there." "Me too," Marcus admitted, "but we stood our ground. That is what matters." He held her tight. "I am proud of you, Margaret. You are the bravest person I have ever known." The next weeks were tense, but nothing happened. No more fires, no more men riding the property lines, no more threats. The lawyer from Sacramento came to visit and assured them that he had filed injunctions that would prevent Calloway from interfering with their claim. The newspaper ran a follow-up article, and public opinion was firmly on their side. Slowly, gradually, Marcus and Margaret began to relax, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had won. Summer turned to fall, and the aspens on the mountainsides blazed gold. Marcus rebuilt the barn, bigger and better than before, and Margaret harvested vegetables from the garden and put them up for winter. They worked side by side every day, building their life together, and at night, they lay in each other's arms and talked about the future. In October, Margaret realized that she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and she was often queasy in the mornings. At first, she was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope, but when she finally told Marcus, his face lit up with such pure joy that she started crying. "A baby," he said wonderingly, putting his hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Margaret, you have made me the happiest man alive." "We are going to need that extra room built before spring," Margaret said through her tears, "and a cradle, and so many other things. Oh, Marcus, I am so happy I can hardly breathe." They spent the winter preparing for the baby and continuing to build up their ranch. The legal case against Calloway dragged on, but the lawyer was optimistic. Witnesses had come forward, other ranchers willing to testify about Calloway's tactics. The sheriff had been removed from office pending an investigation into corruption. Slowly but surely, the web of intimidation that Calloway had built was being pulled apart. In February, they got word that Calloway had settled out of court, paying damages to several families he had driven off their land and agreeing to cease any claims on Marcus's property in exchange for the charges being dropped. It was not perfect justice, but it was justice enough. The land was theirs, free and clear, and Calloway was a broken man, his reputation in tatters. "It is over," Marcus said, holding the legal documents in his hands. "It is really over." Margaret, now visibly pregnant, put her arms around him as well as she could, with her growing belly between them. "No," she said, "it is just beginning." Their son was born in late May, on a warm evening when the valley was full of birdsong and the smell of wildflowers. Margaret labored through the day with Marcus beside her, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths. Mrs. Chen had come from Downeyville to help with the birth, and she guided Margaret through each contraction with the calm competence of someone who had brought many babies into the world. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Marcus wept openly. "He is beautiful," he said, his voice shaking. "Margaret, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness as she held their son. Marcus thought for a long moment. "Matthew," he said finally. "Matthew Marcus Montgomery, after my father and yours. So he will carry both our histories." "Matthew," Margaret repeated, looking down at the tiny face. "Hello, Matthew. Welcome to the world, little one." The years that followed were full of hard work and happiness. Marcus expanded the ranch, adding more cattle and building the big house he had dreamed of. Margaret proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, and their home was filled with laughter. Matthew was followed by a daughter they named Mary, then another son called Michael, and finally twin girls, Miriam and Melanie. The valley rang with the sounds of children playing, of horses nickering in the barn, of Margaret singing as she worked in her kitchen. Marcus built a schoolroom onto the house and taught the children to read and write. Margaret taught them to garden and cook and stand up for what was right. Together they built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. James Fletcher became Uncle James to the children, a frequent visitor who brought presents and tall tales and helped Marcus with the work. Mrs. Chen and Tom came to visit every summer, and the children loved hearing stories about how their parents had met. The story of how Margaret had saved Marcus's life became family legend, told and retold with different embellishments each time. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus took Margaret up to a high meadow where wildflowers grew thick as carpet. They stood together looking down at the valley, at the house and barns and fences, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the garden where their children were playing. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked, putting his arm around her waist. "Marrying a shot-up cowboy you barely knew? Leaving town to come live in the middle of nowhere?" Margaret leaned into him, solid and warm in hers. "Not for a single second," she said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Marcus Montgomery. You and our children and this life we built, I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "Even the part where I bled all over your kitchen table?" Marcus asked, smiling. "Especially that part," Margaret said, laughing. "Because that is where it all started. That is where I found out what I was capable of. I saved your life, and in doing so, I found my own." Marcus kissed her, tender and deep, the way he had kissed her on their wedding day and 1,000 times since. "I love you, Margaret Vance Montgomery, today and always." "And I love you," Margaret said, "forever and beyond." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Below them, their children's laughter rang out like music. Around them, the land they had fought for and won stretched out in every direction, abundant and beautiful and theirs. It had started with a gunshot at sunset, and a woman brave enough to drag a dying man to safety. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined that first desperate night. A partnership built on trust and love and stubborn determination. A family that filled their home with noise and joy, a legacy that would outlast them both. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the deepening blue of the sky, Marcus and Margaret walked hand in hand back down to the valley, to the house full of children and light and love. They had faced death and danger and won. They had built something lasting and true, and every single day they chose each other all over again. The ranch continued to prosper. Matthew grew into a serious young man who loved working with the cattle. Mary inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's way with horses. Michael had a gift for fixing things, taking apart machinery and putting it back together better than before. The twins, Miriam and Melanie, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief with identical innocent smiles. When Matthew turned 18, Marcus and Margaret deeded him a portion of the land to start his own claim. They did the same for each of their children as they came of age, helping them build their own lives while keeping the family close. The valley that had once held a single small cabin became home to a whole community of Montgomerys, and eventually their spouses and children. Margaret's hair turned gray, then white, but her eyes still sparkled with the same determination they had held the night she dragged Marcus inside to save his life. Marcus's shoulder gave him pain in cold weather, but he never complained, just flexed his arm and remembered the woman who had fought death itself to keep him alive. They grew old together in the house they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The story of the cowboy shot off his horse at sunset, and the woman who saved him became part of family history, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about courage and love and the kind of partnership that could survive anything. On a warm summer evening when they were both in their 70s, Marcus and Margaret sat on the porch of their big house, watching the sun set over the mountains, just as they had done thousands of times before. His hand was wrapped around hers, their fingers intertwined, and neither felt the need to fill the comfortable silence with words. "Do you remember that first sunset?" Margaret finally said. "The one where everything changed?" "Every detail," Marcus said. "The color of the sky, the sound of the shot, the way you looked standing over me like an avenging angel." He squeezed her hand gently. "Best day of my life, getting shot off that horse, because it led me to you." "Only you would say that getting shot was the best thing that ever happened to you," Margaret said, laughing. "It was not the getting shot part that was good," Marcus clarified. "It was everything that came after. You, us, all of this." He gestured at the valley spread out before them, at the houses dotting the landscape, at the grandchildren playing in the yard below. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The air was full of the sound of insects and the lowing of cattle and the distant laughter of their descendants. It was the sound of a life well lived, of a legacy built on love and hard work and standing firm against those who would try to tear it down. "No regrets?" Marcus asked softly. "Not a single one," Margaret replied. "You?" "Only that I did not meet you sooner," Marcus said. "But then again, maybe we needed to be exactly who we were, exactly when we were, to find each other." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe we were always meant to find each other, and the universe just took its time setting everything up." She lifted her head to look at him, seeing past the lines and gray hair to the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Thank you for letting me save you." "Thank you for being strong enough to do it," Marcus said, "and thank you for choosing me every single day since." "Always," Margaret said, and kissed him as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. They sat together until the stars came out, two people who had built an empire from nothing but determination and love, whose story had started with violence and desperation, and grown into something beautiful and lasting. When they finally went inside, it was hand in hand, just as they had done everything else. Marcus and Margaret Montgomery lived into their 80s, long lives full of joy and hard work, and the satisfaction of knowing they had created something that would last. When they finally passed, within months of each other, because neither could bear to be parted for long, they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, where they could watch over their descendants and the land they had loved. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, "Marcus and Margaret Montgomery, who faced the sunset together and built a legacy from love." But the real monument to their lives was not carved in stone. It was in the thriving community of ranches spread across the valley, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward, in the stories passed down through generations about the cowboy who was shot off his horse at sunset, and the woman who dragged him inside and fought to save his life, and in doing so, saved them both.